Bakkavoy doing the sort of traditional historical critical work drawing on the ancient Near East, whether we have anything to say to each other. And this, I think, is the question that's not really being asked even, but is probably the question that needs to be asked right now.
It's been a couple years ago now that I was teaching a class in Institute, and I threw out a question to my class, and I said, who do you think are the big scholars of the Book of Mormon in church history? And it's interesting that you bring up the W.W. Phelps and the Pratts and these people. Hugh Nibley was on the list, but the only three people that any of my class could name were Cleon Skousen, Joseph Fielding Smith, and Bruce R. McConkie. Now, of course, that's very unscientific, and it's just a small selection of members in a LDS Institute course. But why do you think those names come to mind and not the names that you mentioned?
I think that, I mean, there's a big long history to tell there as well, right? But the short version is simply that those three figures in particular are the sort of dominant gospel scholars from the mid-20th century and into the 70s, 80s. That, I mean, they're sort of like the household names of gospel scholarship. I mean, Bruce R. McConkie never wrote a book on the Book of Mormon. Joseph Fielding Smith never wrote a book on the Book of Mormon. Cleon Skousen, to my knowledge, didn't write a whole book on the Book of Mormon, but they all wrote books on basic gospel doctrine, on answering your questions about, this, that, and the other thing in, the scriptures or Mormon history or whatever, a lot on the New Testament, Old Testament, and so forth, but none of them was really dedicated to the Book of Mormon. So my guess is just that there's this kind of popular idea in Mormon culture that these are the great scholars of the Book of Mormon simply because they're recognized as the great scholars of Mormonism, right? By lay members of the church. And I think that's justifiable. But they haven't, I mean, none of those three has really said anything terribly productive about the Book of Mormon at an academic level, certainly, and even more at, say, a theological or a doctrinal level. They've focused elsewhere: Old Testament, New Testament, history, etc.
So speaking of people that have done serious work on the Book of Mormon and have a book on the Book of Mormon, you have a book. One of the things that we'll turn to and talk about now, called Another Testament on Typology, published by Salt Press. And just to throw out my own biases, I will say this is one of the best books on the Book of Mormon I've read. Definitely in my top 5, if not in my top 2 to 3.
Well, thank you.
And I'm not just saying that. I don't say things I don't mean, just to throw that out too. I have your book on my bookshelf at home, and the first thing that people do when they pick it up is they turn to me with this puzzled look on their face and they ask, what the heck is typology? So how would you answer that? And maybe you've got this question in real life, and why did you choose that as the title of your book?
Yeah, no, I get this question often. Well, I chose it as the subtitle because that's what the book talks about primarily. I mean, I worried about how obscure that might seem, but I think it's actually very simple to explain. Typology is a very traditional Christian way of reading Scripture. So in the Christian tradition, there's this idea, and I think Mormons are very familiar with this idea, that in order to make sense of Scripture, especially of the Old Testament, we need to look at the way that the Old Testament anticipates the New Testament. So, for example, we look at the Law of Moses and we say this or that aspect of the Law of Moses, this or that ritual, is a type or a shadow or a symbol of Christ. It's a figure of Christ. And that's the idea of typology. The classic formulation in the Christian world is the Old Testament is revealed in the New, and the New Testament is the key to the Old. So that's the idea of typology. What I'm doing in the book is looking at the way that typology is used in the Book of Mormon. It's used explicitly. This shouldn't be a term that's that unfamiliar to Latter-day Saints. The Book of Mormon mentions it by name several times over. And what I argue is that there's a constant central discussion about typological reading of Scripture in the Book of Mormon that we tend to completely ignore when we read it.
Now, I don't want to turn this whole interview into a vocabulary lesson, so this will be the last question about vocabulary, but you use a couple more words that might not be completely familiar to some of our listeners here. Could you briefly define the terms? I know this might be a little hard to do, but briefly define the terms exegesis and hermeneutics, or at least what you mean when you use the terms. I only ask this because they appear in the title of your chapters, and a short definition might make what these chapters are about more clear to some if they're just happen to pick up your book and they're like, oh, maybe I want to read chapter 3, per se.
In my defense, I will note that Elder Christofferson used both of these words in a general conference talk recently, but anyway.
And I remember people laughing after he used those words.
Yeah, quite.
Too.
Yeah, the whole crowd burst out and laughing. So, simple definitions. I mean, usually exegesis is a word that's simply used to mean something like scriptural interpretation, interpretation of texts. Hermeneutics is sometimes used the same way in the technical field of interpretation of Scripture and so forth. There's actually a difference between these two terms that's important. Exegesis is used to mean historical critical interpretation. That is, trying to look at a text's basic structures, its historical influences, trying to fix a date or a historical setting in which the text was originally produced. And so it's a much more trying to fix it in history and discover its sort of essential features, but without trying to decide what it implies about the way one ought to live or any of those kinds of questions. Those are bracketed, if you will. Hermeneutics, on the other hand, is used by scholars to talk about the way that one then appropriates what one finds in a text. So it's a form of interpretation, but an interpretation in light of present concerns, of contemporary issues and so forth. So to use a quick example, if we were talking about the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7. To do an exegesis of that text would be to say, first, okay, what do we know about where this text came from? Was this actually spoken by Jesus? Who actually spoke the text originally? Or how did it come together? Does it come from various sources? When is it patched together? What kind of historical circumstances and influences are revealed in the text, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To do a hermeneutics of the text would then be to take it and say, now I've solved all of those kinds of things. They give me a good sense of what the text is doing or what it's saying. But what I want to ask now is, what does it tell me about the way I ought to live, say, a life of consecration? Or what might it tell me about the way to give myself to a Christian life in particular? Or how does it speak to this particular theological concern I have about, say, prayer or blah, blah, blah. So that would be the difference, right? Exegesis keeps things, as it were, within their historical context, and hermeneutics tries to open them up into the present and our own concerns.
So for the most part, I'd say that hermeneutics would be something that the LDS person would be most accustomed of hearing at, say, like a sacrament meeting or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We don't do a whole lot of exegesis commonly in the Mormon tradition. I mean, scholars do, but I think on the sort of popular everyday level, we don't do a whole lot of exegesis, but we do a lot of hermeneutics. And part of what I'm trying to do in this work and a lot of my work in general is trying to do good, solid exegesis so that the hermeneutic work is well-founded and not simply the sort of wresting the scriptures to try to sort out my own concerns or something like that, but instead getting a good handle on what the text seems to be doing on its own terms, and then allowing that to speak to whatever I'm working through.
In your book, you deal quite a bit with someone that many people try to avoid, and that's Isaiah. The Isaiah chapters are notoriously difficult for many LDS readers. However, when you mention Isaiah, you also introduce another character into a mix. So maybe this goes into another vocabulary thing, but he's somebody that scholars call Second Isaiah. Who is Second Isaiah, and why should Book of Mormon readers care about him?
Yeah, okay. That's well put. So traditionally, no, I shouldn't say traditionally, I should